welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to today's morning briefing. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Karl Kaiser Forum, which is a new initiative here at DGAP, gathering top thinkers and practitioners to work on big long-term questions of German foreign policy and to contribute to what one might call a strategic culture. More on that project soon. In today's briefing, we will try and understand what has happened since last Friday's clash in the Oval Office. And it's not easy to keep track, I admit. After the heated exchange, which is, by the way, worth watching in full, President Trump ordered a pause on shipments of US military aid to Ukraine. President Zelensky then attended a summit of European leaders in London on Sunday, seeking to build a coalition of the willing to guarantee a lasting peace in Ukraine. On Tuesday, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen presented a plan boosting Europeans' defense industry by a package worth 800 billion euros, which, besides common European efforts, includes a mechanism allowing member states to ramp up defense spending without triggering the excessive deficit procedure. Also on Tuesday, amidst coalition talks in Berlin, the leaders of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats decided to revise debt rules to unleash major defense spending. The law to be introduced in the Bundestag probably next week would exempt defense spending above 1% of GDP from the so-called debt brake. Also on Tuesday, in his address to Congress, President Trump signaled a certain kind of rapprochement, saying that he had received a conciliatory letter from Zelensky and that all parties were ready for peace. And today, in Brussels, European leaders are gathering for a special summit. So things are very much in flux and hard to understand. Does any of this amount to a coherent strategy from the White House? What are the implications for Ukraine immediately and for the Transatlantic Security Order more generally? And what can Europeans and Germans do now? To discuss these pressing questions, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. First, Rachel Tausendfreund, who's a senior research fellow for United States and transatlantic relations here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she was a senior fellow and editorial director at the German Marshall Fund, GMF. She's a frequent contributor and commentator in German and international media on US politics and society, something that's all the more needed since November 6th last year. Next will be Dr. Aylin Matlé, who's a senior research fellow in the Center for Security and Defense here at DGAP. Previously, she was deputy head of the Israel Bureau of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Jerusalem and a research associate and PhD candidate at Martin-Luther-Universität in Halle-Wittenberg. She wrote her dissertation on recent American and European NATO policy and is therefore excellently qualified for today's briefing. Welcome, Aylin. Last but certainly not least is Rolf Nikel, who was vice president of DGAP, and before retiring, Rolf Nikel was a career diplomat. In his most recent post from 2014 to 2020, he was the German ambassador to Poland, and prior to that, federal government commissioner for disarmament and arms control. Previous posts included Moscow, Nairobi, Paris, and Washington, as well as the federal chancellery. Thanks so much, Rolf, for joining us today to make sense of things.
Happy to be here.
Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks and then open up for questions about 30 minutes in. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and when invited to speak, keep it relatively brief so we can pick up as many comments and questions as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues supporting this morning briefing series: Henning Hoff, Milan Nitsch, Patrick Teichmann, Lily Hong, Wiebke Ebering, Helga Beck, and many others. Now, I'm gathering that our colleague Rachel is having trouble logging into Zoom, so we'll... Oh, here we are.
I made it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rachel. So straight on to you. What happened in the Oval there? What's to be expected from Trump? Is there a strategy? What's going on? Help us make sense.
I mean, actually, one shouldn't have been surprised. I mean, one should, in the context of American modern history, be very surprised by what happened in the Oval Office. But in the context of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the Russia-Ukraine story, one should not have been surprised. Donald Trump believes the Russian narrative about Ukraine. This was clear during his first term. All of these stories about Ukrainian corruption and even to a certain extent the Nazi stories, and the stories that somehow Europe and Ukraine provoked this war. I mean, he genuinely tends to believe that story more than the Western story. Genuinely, he doesn't listen to his own intelligence services, as we know. He gets his information from Fox News and social media, and he's swimming in right-wing social media circles that are, as we know, deeply infiltrated by Russian narratives on these things. Secondly, he has his own kind of personal history with Zelensky and Ukraine and has personal grievances against them. But most importantly, Trump really wants a deal. He promised the deal on the campaign. He wants to show that, he could succeed where Biden failed. And Putin obviously doesn't want the deal, or isn't eager to come to the table. And this is why we see Trump making overture after overture after overture toward Putin, which for me signals he's realized it's not that easy to get Putin to the table. And the person he can squeeze is Vladimir Zelensky, unfortunately for Vladimir Zelensky. So this is some of the strategy, if you want to call it strategy, behind what happened. And the final point is this is also the Trumpian and Vance, to a certain extent, idea about foreign policy. The US is sort of big and strong, and we're getting taken advantage of by all of these allies and partners. And so he wanted more groveling, right? And this was part of the show as well. He wanted to sort of present himself as someone who's pushing Zelensky as the strong person, and it also worked very well for them that they could kind of show Zelensky as someone who's not cooperative. But if you go to a meeting with Donald Trump and you want something from Donald Trump, that's a very difficult situation to be in. And he is not going to follow any of the normal sort of rules of diplomacy or state-to-state interaction. That's not how he works. And we saw all of this in front of the cameras, unfortunately, last Friday. So the strategy is a deal, some kind of deal as quick as possible. And so far, the strategy to get to that from the Trump team is placating Russia, giving Russia everything it wants in order for Russia to start agreeing to some kind of talks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for this analysis, Rachel. Quick follow-up before we move on to Aylin. Given the buying into Russian narratives, the personal grievances, and the urge to get a deal from the Trump side, what is to be expected in the midterm? I mean, some people are talking about he's going for a reverse Kissinger. This is a complete reversal of alliances. The Trump administration is trading its longtime allies Europe for Russia in its pivot to Asia and China. Where do you see, I know this is really difficult and because his behavior is so erratic, but where do you see things going midterm?
I mean, that is the problem. So first of all, I don't buy this reverse Kissinger narrative. I don't, somebody online thinks they're some big strategist and therefore they're, suggested this narrative. But, the people who study China say there's just no world in which this makes any sense. And this includes also the people who are serious about foreign policy in the Trump world, right? So there's talk about this. I think there's talk about this to also kind of pretend that there's some kind of really smart strategy going on. The problem with estimating where it will go is you don't know how much Trump is going to be actively involved in the details of what's arranged. So there's a world in which there's a mineral deal and there's European forces on the ground that are securing some kind of ceasefire line. And so, it looks like a ceasefire that the US is not really engaged in. And Trump's then happy about that. But in the background of these troops in Ukraine are US surveillance capacity, is, the air-to-air refueling, all of the things that the European forces would need to be really strong. It's just they're not obvious. And there's a kind of cooperation. And there are people in the Trump administration and the strategists who kind of think about these things. That's the deal they want. They want a deal that, though does rely on Europeans really, having more skin in the game than Americans. But if Trump's at the table, it's really hard to say what will happen in the end, because he's not thinking in these terms and he's not taking the advice of the strategists as much as he was in his first term.
That's a really interesting point that I'm sure we'll come back to the people in the Trump administration not being a coherent strategic whole, but perhaps a little more complicated than that. Thanks for now. Let's move on to Aylin, and let's move on to the security implications, both for Ukraine and for the transatlantic security order in general. What's your take, Aylin?
Thanks, Jan, and good morning. So the consequences for the transatlantic security order or system, if you will, I think it is still quite uncertain to say for sure. What is for sure, I think, is that, and that is a bit of a truism by now, Europeans must be doing way more than they have in the past. There is movement in that regard. I will come back to that in just a minute. Yet, first of all, it will take time, maybe not as much time as it would have maybe a couple of weeks or months ago, since the inauguration of Donald Trump. And secondly, at least in my understanding, it's not yet clear how Europeans want to treat the US, given that that they are still heavily dependent on US security assistance in many respects. Now, this might be a bit of a unpopular assessment at the moment, but still, I don't see a hardcore divorce in the making, in especially in NATO. I can come back to that later in our Q&A if you want to. So, but maybe let me turn to what I think Europeans and especially Germany must do now in order to react to the sort of uncertainty that we're definitely witnessing in the transatlantic security realm at the moment. First off, and that is really a no-brainer by now, luckily, Germany must increase its defense spending. Jan, you've already alluded to the decisions that are in the making in the current, or sort of in the current government and the caretaker government, but even more importantly, in the parties that will most likely form the next government. Given NATO's 2% spending baseline, Germany should lead by committing to at least 3% or maybe even 3.5% by 2028, because that is the year the special fund for the armed forces, the so-called Sondervermögen, will have run dry in all likelihood. And this increase must align with NATO's planning procedures, though, in order to ensure Europe's collective deterrence and defense. The current NDPP, NATO's defense planning process, is at a stage currently at which capability packages will be assigned to nation states, most likely in early June prior to the NATO summit in The Hague. Thus, it is all the more important that Germany moves quickly in a sense of making commitments and organizing the necessary funds credibly and sustainably in order to back up those commitments. Secondly, efficient and Europe-oriented defense procurement. Again, we are seeing movement in that respect as well. Just as a sort of contextualization, Germany's current procurement processes are still quite inefficient and costly, largely due to small order quantities that drive up unit prices compared to bulk purchases. Luckily, to address these issues, the outgoing government introduced a national security and defense industry strategy only last December. And in that strategy, there are a couple of very useful and valuable suggestions that the incoming government should be seriously considering implementing. And then thirdly, closing potential strategic capability gaps. The next German government must really work together with European partners to develop and acquire strategic defense capabilities that are currently, by and large, covered by the US, particularly with regards to deep strike capabilities, reconnaissance, airlift capabilities, among many other things. And then finally, enhancing operational readiness. Germany, together again, obviously with other Europeans, because Germany cannot undertake that on its own, should move forward in the advancement of integrating forces across EU and NATO member states, which by now, as we all know, are by and large the same, in order to integrate their forces that so far at least have rarely been tested in terms of operational readiness, i.e. actual deployments, which clearly by this point should be the level of ambition. And then I know, I think I'm sort of running out of time.
Let's return to the specifics of this in our conversation in just a bit, and I definitely want to come back to the capabilities as well. There's been a paper recently by our president, Tom Enders, and some others on some of the specifics that the German defense industry could and perhaps should ramp up now. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But for now, let me turn to Ambassador Nikel, dear Rolf. The things that Aylin just laid out that need doing now on a German and European level require coherence and a political willingness to put them into practice. How do you see political reactions in Europe and especially Germany since this clash in the Oval Office last week? And what are your expectations for things to proceed now at today's special council, but in general as well?
Thank you very much. Let me first, before I answer your question, rapidly come back to what's been said before. There was mention of U.S. strategy or no strategy. I think at this time we cannot talk of something like a Trump doctrine. This guy is telling something today and the exact opposite tomorrow. He's surrounded by China hawks on the one side, by European hawks on the other, and so it's very hard to predict what he's going to do. Also, secondly, important thing is what has been overlooked in the spat in the Oval Office was the fact that the president himself said directly, explicitly, that he is committed to NATO. Now, what is it worth is another question. And we have to assume, unfortunately, the worst case scenario. But we have to be very careful in assessing what has been done and what it means for the future. Now, what does it mean for us? I think what one can say after the so-called double wumms bazooka that has been started by the two new coalition partners, hopefully become new coalition partners, is actually Germany is back. Germany is back on track in committing funds for defense, big funds for defense, whatever it takes, with no limit, with no upper limit, and that's a real change in German foreign policy. Especially difficult though for the CDU, and of course it's a highly risky business. I'm, by the way, amazed how many gamblers are around and Friedrich when he's doing this, because there are high political risks and constitutional risks, because to adopt that with the old Bundestag, you don't know, and the Bundesrat, by the way, as well. Yeah, you need Bavaria and you need the Freie Wähler. So it's risky business, and somebody eventually will go to Karlsruhe to question all this. So it's a high risk business, but it's a commitment, a real commitment, which answers what we've been asking for for a very long time in this think tank and many other think tanks in Europe. So concretely, I think what is clear now is that, or what is not clear, in fact, is America still on our side to deter Russian aggression and defend the continent? I would say this question is premature. We cannot be sure, but we should prepare for all contingencies, even the worst case scenario. And that means that we have to get our act together. And I think we're actually doing this. There is this you, Jan, just mentioned, this interesting paper by our president, Thomas Enders, with some other people on what should be done in the short term. And I think that's very important to realize that we have to do many things that we do in the short term, but also be realistic as what can be achieved. It's not only a question of money. Money is important and nothing happens without money, but what cooperation with the US is essentially necessary for at least the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to enablers and other things. So it's important that we keep that in mind, that we cannot have whatever we decide also today in Brussels. We should not expect quick results because there are certain things that can be done, and then mobilizing funds is important, also on the national level, but also on the European level. But that's only half the story. When it comes to the council today, it looks as if the proposals by Ursula von der Leyen may sail through better than initially assumed. They're the kind of usual suspects for being against everything, like the Hungarians and the Slovaks, apparently seem to have come around, at least when it comes to mobilizing more funds for European defense, but not necessarily for mobilizing funds with respect to Ukraine. The Commission proposal sounds great, 800 billion euros, but it's in fact only the authorization by the Commission to spend that money nationally without being held accountable on the deficit procedure. In any case, we will only be able to address all these problems if we stay together. So the theoretical answer, of course, is the answer to America first is Europe united, but we really have to stay united on this. If we don't, then we can forget about everything, including the also very important question, which I can only mention here, which is the question of the nuclear guarantee. So things are moving into the right direction. People are gambling, and hopefully the gamble will turn out to be positive and successful for the good of Europe and for the good of Germany as well.
Thanks, Rolf. So now, and I'm glad that you bring up the nuclear question, because that's something that, Aylin, you probably alluded to when talking about European capabilities, but didn't really spell out. So I'd like you to comment on this briefly, if you will. There's already a question in the chat, and let me encourage everyone in the audience to come forward with questions in person or in writing if you want. And so first question on nuclear deterrence and European capabilities to Aylin. The question by Josef von Falkenhausen in the chat is about the apparent success of the Trump administration so far, and how much longer this is going to go on. So this is something I think that's directed to you, Rachel, and perhaps if I can add a question to that myself. I think, Rachel, in one of the previous briefings, you commented on the extent to which the Trump administration is ready to act even against courts, and so also cause some domestic upheaval that might lead in the direction of some sort of coup, to mention that terrifying word. So how successful is Trump domestically with these things? There's some conflicting public opinion data as well that he used himself in this speech in front of Congress. So perhaps you can comment on the success of Trump really as well. And let me pick up one more question for the first round by my colleague Mario Baumann.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for your inputs, Mario Baumann from DGAP. I wanted to direct a question to Aylin Matlé. We have heard that, well, and we see currently that huge sums are being made available to boost military capabilities in Germany and in Europe. And then, of course, it's a political question of whether these resources are spent primarily or as a priority on procuring fast stocks, for example, from the US, or whether they are spent on developing European capabilities for Europe itself, like also including strategic enablers. So my question is, where do you see that we are heading? Is it increasing cooperation with the US also in terms of procurement and procuring US capabilities? Or is it towards developing European capabilities? And this also refers, of course, to the paper by Tom Enders, which I think favored the latter. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. My colleagues will be happy to share a link in the chat shortly that will point our listeners to the paper by Tom Enders and others, which appeared in German. But you'll get the link shortly in the chat. Let's start with answers by Rachel and then move on to Aylin.
So is it working? Or how successful is Trump? I mean, one of my deep frustrations about what's happening right now is that Trump seems to have been more right about the European partners than all of the European-friendly presidents before him. And I think this is something when there's time. There's not time right now. Right now is the time to act, but this is something that Europeans need to think about. Why is it that the gentle, supportive prodding in the past, frankly, 20 years did not have the effect, and it did in fact take a sort of strong-arm, neglectful president to make this happen. This underscores Trump's points that alliances are not working for the United States, and I'm sad that he's in some way being proven right by the European partners. That said, fine, right? If it takes Trump in the end to make that happen, make the things happen that we've known need to happen, right? Increased European cooperation and capability, then I mean, fine. There's no choice right now, and so in that sense, he's being successful, right? Now, is he really successful though? I mean, if he continues on his track and there isn't a kind of reining in, then we are going to have, the European part of NATO kind of turning away from the US, developing independent capabilities. The question was European producers or US producers, right? They're going to naturally turn toward European producers. And all of these things for those in the US, including some in the Trump administration who are thinking strategically about this, that's not in the medium and long term good for the United States. Good for the United States is a well-functioning NATO with a much stronger European part, and I always include the UK in the NATO Europeans. But he's playing his hand so forcefully that Europeans are going to start not relying on the US, and that's strategically not good in the medium and long term. If you look at other things, for example, the tariff policies, he threatened against Canada and Mexico 25%, then he paused it, and then he reinstated it, and the stock market reacted unfavorably. And 2 days later, he's now, or not even, announced that certain big US auto companies will be exempted from the tariffs, meaning he's already having to course correct because reality is punishing some of these policy decisions. So I think the more that, or, He's also not successful with the peace. This is also what we're seeing. He hasn't been able to bring Putin to the table in the way he was sure that he would. And he can't fake it in the way that he would like to. And so, his approval ratings, I mean, there was one poll, that's the only poll out of, 30 that had these kind of numbers. So I think you have to be very questionable about this poll. His approval ratings are the lowest ever of a president after a first term. I mean, partly this is polarization, but it's also real. The American public is not happy with how he's sort of addressing economic issues. And the real bite of tariffs haven't even hit yet. The Supreme Court just upheld a ruling of a lower federal court that they had to unfreeze some of this money that Elon Musk's Doge team froze. So also in the judiciary, he's taking some losses. The question that you mentioned, Jan, that I raised earlier is, are they going to listen to the courts? And that is a really scary question to have to be posing. So far, they haven't been blatantly disregarding the courts. I mean, JD Vance is saying on Twitter that they should, but the actual kind of official answers are, oh, we're trying to, yes, we need more time, things like this. So this is the big question that that remains out there. How bad is it going to get? How quickly, in terms of a real breach of the rule of law in the United States? But it's already really bad. I don't think we cannot have any illusions. I mean, this Senate confirmed Kash Patel and the FBI and Tulsi Gabbard as national intelligence, and these are dangerously unserious people, and the Republicans in the Senate wouldn't have needed to say yes if our democratic system was functioning.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll come back to some of these questions. There are already two more on Trump potentially trying to stay in power after this term, and also another question about U.S. willingness to put boots on the ground to protect the mineral deal. So we'll have more for you for the next round, but let's move on to Aylin for now.
Thank you. So first off, just in order to insert a bit of optimism into our conversation, during a hearing that took place on Tuesday this week, the Perm Rep nominee to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, actually committed in that hearing to NATO, and also using very strong words like, that the US will continue to be committed to NATO in an ironclad manner, which is actually the exact wording and phrasing that the Biden administration used. Whether we can count on that or not, I agree with Rolf Nikel on that. That's a bit of another question, but I think we also have to sort of listen and judge our assessment not only by the words that we're hearing, but also by actions that are taken. And so far, at least, the US has not announced to withdraw US troops on a very large scale from Europe. And then secondly, and that brings me to the second part, the nuclear dimension, the US is, at least as it currently stands, still committing itself to provide nuclear Senate deterrence to Europe. At the same time, I think it makes sense. It would have made sense already a couple of years ago when Macron offered to talk about that for the first time in 2020, to at least consider possible ways of Europeanizing nuclear deterrence. There are, and we would need a session dedicated only to that, because it's a very it's a complicated matter. But let it suffice to say that France, and that's the reason why France again is offering to have those conversations, would be much better suited than the UK, other NATO European nuclear power, to lead on those talks, because first off, they have more nuclear warheads in store as opposed to the UK. secondly, and almost more importantly, those warheads are produced in France. Unlike the UK, France does not depend on the US delivering warheads to the nuclear arsenal. And then thirdly, France's nuclear arsenal is both sea and air borne. I do not, at least at the time being, foresee a European nuclear sharing arrangement akin to what the US is offering in NATO at the moment. However, there are other options, like, for example, stationing Rafale aircraft that are the delivery systems in the French nuclear doctrine that would be delivering nuclear warheads to be stationed on German soil for a short period of time, for example. Or France has also mentioned, I think that is also a feasible option and road to go down, to have other non-nuclear European allies participate in nuclear exercises. So there are a couple of items that are feasible and that could also be feasible in the very short term, that without necessarily replacing the US at the time being. And I also think it might, while I understand that we also have to think about the long term, at the same time, who knows whether Macron will still be president in the next couple of years, and then we might have a president in Paris who might not be willing to give out those guarantees. So I think we shouldn't sort of put all our eggs in one basket, which obviously at the moment we're doing with regards to the US. So diversifying that equation, right, I think is prudent. And then lastly, I know. Just one very short comment on Mario's question. I think it will be a mixture of both at the moment for the foreseeable future. We're not going to be self-sufficient in the next 1, 2, or 3 years in all respects when it comes to military capabilities. What we might be seeing more of is what the US and what the US agreed to last year, namely to station longer range deep strike precision capabilities in Germany beginning in 2026, a capability that Europeans simply do not possess at the moment. At the same time, very shortly after that announcement, a group of European allies announced that they would invest in developing those precise capabilities, but that will take time. We're talking about at least, like a time frame of 4, 6, maybe 7 years. But that might be a sort of model that we might be seeing more of going forward.
You're right, Aylin. Defense procurement and nuclear deterrence are topics that we should spend an entire morning briefing on. We did, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, talk about nuclear deterrence and the revision of NATO nuclear strategy with Karl-Heinz Kamp, the video of which you can find on our website. But let's move on to another question by Tom O'Donnell in the audience, please.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to put this to both Rachel and Rolf as sort of disagreeing and see what you have to say about it. I think the question of, first of all, we really do have to take seriously what is Trump's grand strategy, whether we'll historically call it that or not. This goes way back. And when he first came in office last time, he wanted a very similar policy of blocking with the Russians against the Chinese. And there's a history to this in American policy. FDR was very extreme about it, even after Finland, even after, Ukraine, Holodomor, and so forth. He sided with Russia against Germany. And yes, there's also the example of Nixon, which is a milder example of splitting the other way with China. So he wanted this when he first came in office last time. If you look back at the people he appointed and what they were saying, but that all fell apart. Now I feel he's much better prepared. And so I think we have to take it seriously and what that means. And not only identify if that's what it is, but is it justified? And I'll tell you, it's not that different than what the Biden people were saying before the full-scale invasion. They were saying whatever happens here, what should I say, off the record or Nobody ever, whatever happens here, I think in this administration, we have to remember that China is going to be more important. And Biden was very upset with Zelensky before the war started, not only for not openly, agreeing that the war was going to start, but he disagreed with many internal policies that he saw as corrupt, and his people would tell you that. So anyway, we should look at that. The other thing is the superpower, as far as what happened in Vance's office, I sort of disagree. It now makes sense to me. The superpower wants to do the negotiations in a certain way without pre-guarantees and without Ukraine at the table. And Trump makes very clear why. He says these people hate each other. I have to go back and forth between them, and I have to appear as to not be prejudicing for one side or another to get this over with. Now, we might disagree with that, but Europe, the leaders have accepted this, especially Macron and Starmer, that this is reality. And apparently, Zelensky, by saying he would come and sign this deal on the minerals, was agreeing to these things. And it's true. When he came, he brought it up himself. First time he talked to the press that he had to talk about these issues. And that began to enrage Vance and Trump, because the whole point was Trump won't proceed until he says he agrees with these things. And he said back in Kiev that he essentially agreed with these things. So it makes sense to me. And I'd like to see it more substantively dealt with. Or comments on this, please.
Thank you. Got it. So I think two sets of questions really on the negotiation dynamics, people at the table, and the extent to which we are seeing a grand strategy or not. Rolf, let's start with you, and then we move on to Rachel.
Yeah, thank you very much. As I said earlier, I fail to see a grand strategy on the part of Trump. Not the kind of strategy we've seen with other U.S. presidents, as you mentioned earlier. He is guided by this notion that he is the big deal maker. Now, making a deal is a means; it's not a strategy. So, if you want to make a deal, you have to have some sort of things you want to do. And it doesn't seem to me very clearly what this is going to be. There is no such a thing as a Trump doctrine. He's siding with Russia, yes, but then he's having a spat with Zelensky, and then he's in this speech in Congress. I've received the letter, great, etc., etc. So this is a back and forth. And I fail to really see a clearly established, well, not written down, but clearly thought out strategy. Also, if you look at the people who are around him, they're very different people. Yeah, there's a difference, even though Marco Rubio didn't say anything during in the Oval Office, but there's a difference between Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio on the one side, and J.D. Vance and others on the other side. So there are conflicting viewpoints, and as some people say, Trump is repeating what he heard last when he talked to a person. So I think we have to be very careful here, and not jump into foregone conclusions about what we have to do. What he wants to do, that is clear, is disruption. But that again is not a strategy. So we have to, as Europeans, we have to prepare for that kind of thing, and that means that we have to prepare also for the worst. Yes, you repeated that he's committed to NATO for the time being, but that may change under whatever circumstance. And commitment to NATO does not necessarily mean commitment to everything NATO does. So, for example, I would assume that U.S. troop presence in Europe will stay the same. At least there is no sign so far that it's going to be reducing. 100,000 U.S. troops in Europe. It's a big thing. 35,000 or so in Germany, with big economic implications. And also, so far, we haven't seen anything which contradicts the U.S. nuclear guarantee for Europe. Now that may change as well. So we are very well advised to move forward in developing our own capabilities and developing our own ideas about what a nuclear guarantee for Europe should look like. And by the way, I prefer that term than the Europeanization of deterrence, because there's not going to be a Europeanization of that. There's going to be possibly, as you say, Aylin, some sort of nuclear sharing, some sort of positioning of nuclear weapons outside French territory. But the decision to employ nuclear weapons will be decided by the US president. There's no by the French president, and the Brits in any case are very limited in what they can do because of the links they have with the US on all of this.
That's right. Let's move to Rachel. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I'm struggling to keep track of, but please, the speakers are welcome to address any of these. I know, Rachel, that you also published recently on this a link that my colleagues will be happy to share on the disruptors and lay people in the U.S. Department of Defense. So that's also something to read up on. But there are a bunch of questions on the table, so I'll just leave it to you, Rachel, to pick.
Yeah, I have also tried to read those in the chat, so I'll see what I can do. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't people involved in the administration or in the circles of administration who have something like grand strategies. But I don't know anyone who studies China who thinks this kind of splitting Russia from China in a sort of alliance way, in the way that, Nixon did it, that's anything that makes sense. Where there is a strategy is, and I think it's not, look, the strategy is China is the real challenge. China is the real challenge, and things like the war in Ukraine and all of the material and resources and attention that's going to that war is a distraction from the real challenge that the US needs to be prepared for. That is absolutely the sort of basis thinking of, most Republicans and the strategists in the Trump administration, and to a certain extent also himself, Trump. I agree with Rolf. I think Trump's strategy is make a deal, fulfill my campaign promises, etc. He's not an international politician. That's not his thing. He has very good political instincts. He is not a grand strategist on international politics. There's no evidence of that, let's say, which isn't to say there aren't people around. J.D. Vance also, by the way, he's not an international strategist. Elbridge Colby is, who's in charge of policy in the Defense Department. And Ukraine is not where the U.S. should be kind of upholding its international credibility. It's not the right place for resources, according to the strategy. And one doesn't want to be weakened by an ongoing conflict with Russia when the real challenge is a conflict with China. That's the grand strategy. Get out of this conflict with Russia in order to be able to focus on the future conflicts, which aren't Russian. Mm-hmm. But the idea that Russia would be then some kind of ally against China, I don't think anyone seriously thinks that. I think the question is to just get Russia sort of sidelined from the focus. And there will not be U.S. boots on the ground in any kind of, I think I'm reading a question in the, and any kind of, protection of a ceasefire line. And frankly, the dumbest thing the Europeans can do is keep asking for that. And definitely don't ask Trump, because then for sure the answer will be no. And by the way, don't ask Trump either if European forces can then depend on, Article 5 or kind of US support in the background. Don't ask. Pretend that you're willing to take European security seriously yourselves, and then say, we're going to do it. This is our plan. We think it's really important. We think Ukrainian security is important for Europe. Therefore, this is our plan. But look, here are a few capabilities in the background that we would need your help on.
Mhm.
You know, reconnaissance, air-to-air, you know, air defense, whatever. And that's the plan. And you take that plan to, you know, Rubio, maybe Hegseth, and you do it that way. But Trump, but more importantly, everybody around Trump who actually is supportive of NATO, sees the strategic value in NATO, but they also only see a strategic value in NATO if the Europeans actually are willing to do something and prove that they take European security seriously themselves. And by the way, Germany needs to be out there saying, of course, we will defend a ceasefire line. This whole like, well, we can't talk about it until there is possibly a ceasefire is terrible.
Yeah, on that, Rachel, I'm glad that you bring up security protections for Ukraine, because while the German coalition talks have been ongoing, the French and British have made commitments, and we haven't really spoken about specifically what Germany can do in this regard. There is also another question on Ukraine in the chat by Joachim Rücker, who's asking about the role of the United Nations and the potential success of going down the UN track in the unfolding quote unquote solution. So security for Ukraine, strategies there, perhaps. Rolf, you could comment especially on the German perspective a little bit, and then we'll do the turns.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have to be very careful. There's a lot of confusion about what can be done in Ukraine or not. I have had some experience in my diplomatic career about this. There is a difference between securing a ceasefire that has been adopted by the parties and of course the UN Security Council. This would be something that could be then enforced by some sort of peacekeepers. Now, Russia has clearly indicated that they would not, and they have of course the veto in the UN Security Council, has clearly indicated that they will not accept it. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and it has to be very separate from that, security guarantees. Yeah, the security guarantees would be upon the invitation of Ukraine into Ukrainian territory, and that would mean, assuming that Russia would be against, that would be the West, the countries that are present, would be intervening directly into the conflict, yeah, by whatever thing they do. So we have to separate those two things, and it's quite unclear what road we're going down, and therefore it's wise, in my view, to be reluctant to say what Germany is going to do. We've been moving ahead very, very far on many issues, but here, on a direct implication of German forces into the conflict, we have to think about this very, very carefully. And what we've seen so far, the proposals of London of a partial ceasefire, etc. This is not going to work. We are far away from that, and I think we should be careful in saying what we will be or what we can do under the circumstances.
Aylin, what's your view?
I agree that Germany doesn't have the capacities to send ground troops on the scale of thousands of soldiers to Ukraine, were that ever to become a reality. However, there are things that Germany could do also in the framework of the sort of the ceasefire deal or the protection and surveillance of the ceasefire deal that France and the UK are currently drawing up and are discussing. For example, with regards to the air defense bit, Germany could, as it does in Poland at the moment, having started again this January, it could, for example, deploy air defense Patriot batteries to either the western parts of Ukraine or at least to border regions, and those take about 200 soldiers. And I think Germany should be able to muster at least that. That's obviously just a sort of piecemeal, but still, I agree totally with Rachel that it would be disastrous if Germany would completely stay out of any sort of ceasefire surveillance package. And at the same time, I agree with Rolf. Yes, we have to be careful about what exactly it is we're talking about, and also a sort of a security mission or a peace mission. Actually, we should sort of be honest with ourselves in that regard. It would be a deterrence mission, meaning that if push came to shove, those European troops would have to be ready to engage in combat with Russian troops. And obviously that is, I think, part of the reason why Europeans are very reluctant to engage in those discussions. But just talking about a sort of a peace deal or a peace mission, I think is a bit misleading. And then since we just one sentence on Ukraine, I'm very sorry for having failed to address Ukraine in my initial remarks. There was just so much on the plate that I wanted to address. We've all heard that the US has announced not only to put a halt to weapons deliveries, but also to intelligence sharing, including target data for air defense, which would result in Ukrainian forces being sort of blind and deaf, which really would put them in a very detrimental situation. However, Jan, you alluded to that in your introductory remarks as well. We are seeing a sort of rapprochement between Ukraine and the US. So in turn, I think there is still, it's not written in stone yet that the US will not, or Trump will not reverse his decision. And also, the already delivered assistance on part of the US might last for a couple more months, at least. And then also, the Europeans are also delivering weapons systems to Ukraine, such as the Patriot system, for example. The sort of the possible problem might be that the US would have to okay those deliveries, since those are US systems. But at the moment, or at least I haven't heard anything in the direction of the US blocking the Europeans to send US-made systems to Ukraine.
You're right, Aylin. Things are moving so fast that I'm afraid some of these assessments might be outdated by later today. But we will come back to them next week in another morning briefing. Before we close, I want to give Rachel and Rolf a chance for just very brief closing remarks. Rachel, you go first.
Sure, thanks. I think what Aylin said is very important. What we're talking about in the end, I mean, first, there has to be some kind of ceasefire that Ukraine and Russia both agree to. And this is a very important point. Ukraine does not have to agree if it's a super terrible deal. And what helps Ukraine be in a position to not agree is European support. So, the Ukrainians are severely weakened without US military and, more importantly, intelligence support. No doubt about it. But they can keep fighting to a certain extent if the Europeans want to keep supporting them. That's a European question. It's sadly not really a US question anymore. So this is the leverage that Europeans have via Kiev. And that's, in the end, then their decision. And without strong European support, then Kiev is in the position to have to take, whatever kind of deal is presented to it. Although it could continue fighting a guerrilla war or something like that. But this is leverage that Kiev really has because Trump really wants a deal. And he wants a deal that will look like an okay deal to everyone so that he can get, so that it looks like a win. And this is not nothing. And then should we get such a deal, then there has to be something like security guarantees. But these guarantees, if I were Ukraine, I wouldn't believe them if there weren't, or I wouldn't feel very confident if there weren't also European people and capacities in there, because Ukraine has had plenty of security guarantees before, and they didn't work well. And so what you're talking about is a deterrence mission. And the question with every deterrence mission, whether we put the borders of that in Ukraine or we put the borders of that at NATO, is, does Russia believe it? Is Russia willing to risk open conflict with the Europeans? Because if, for example, the Europeans were guaranteeing a ceasefire or a freeze or whatever, and Russia really openly attacked a brigade of French, German, and Finnish soldiers, I mean, it's not obvious to me that Trump would be able to keep the US out of that, right? There would be huge political pressure. And so would he guarantee that from the beginning? Absolutely not. And is that a big risk for everyone involved? Sure. But the other option, if we're honest, and is, where is the line? Is the line on whatever line that's drawn in Ukraine that we all agree to defend? Or do we go back to NATO borders and say that's where we're going to defend? And that's strategically, that's a big part of the question right now.
Thanks, Rachel. Rolf, a last sentence or two.
Yeah. Okay. If there is a ceasefire that the parties agree on, which is ordered then by the Security Council of the United Nations, then, which I think is impossible because the Russians are not going to agree to that, then Germany would be able to participate. The other thing, the deterrence mission, upon the invitation of Ukraine into Ukrainian territory and moving the border, the defense border, as you say, Rachel, a couple of 100 kilometers to the east, is something that there is no support for in Germany. This is not going to happen. Let's be very clear about this. This would be an entry of NATO or whatever, whoever participates, an entry of German troops into an ongoing conflict. And I fail to see this. Now, we have to keep in mind the British actor Peter Ustinov, who said, if the world goes down the drain, the last voice is the one of an expert who says that the turn of events is completely impossible. So let's keep that in mind and be a little modest in what we say or what we recommend. Thank you.
Thanks. We couldn't have ended better than with Peter Ustinov. Thanks, Rolf. Thanks to all of our speakers. Next week, from 11th to the 13th of March, there will be the Defense and Strategy Forum in Paris. And we will gather here again on Thursday morning next week on the 13th of March to discuss whatever might have happened until then. Thanks for today, and have a lovely day.